Christina Renee King earned the nickname Cricket from her family due to her petite stature. She was born in 1972 and resided in Kansas City, Kansas. Christina was married to Christopher Wayne Goodall, a professional roofer, and their relationship was filled with love and affection. In 1988, they joyfully welcomed their first child, April, into the world. 3 years later, their family grew with the arrival of their second daughter, Ashley. Unfortunately, Christopher's occupation couldn't adequately support their family, prompting Christina to seek alternative means of providing for them. Sources indicate that she began soliciting clients for financial assistance in an area known as Central Street, offering escort services. Tragically, Christopher found himself incarcerated at some point, leaving Christina feeling hopeless. Despite the societal label she carried, those who knew her believed she was genuinely a good-hearted individual. However, circumstances forced her into a life on the streets, where she faced the harsh realities of a world that often failed to recognize the humanity behind such labels. Christina experienced a brief period of incarceration, but her recent release from prison marked a somber chapter in her life. Unfortunately, the day after her release would be her last. In 1998, April, who was in 5th grade and celebrating her 10th Christmas, received devastating news. On Christmas morning, a group of boys scavenging for scrap metal in the driveway of an abandoned nursing home made a horrifying discovery. They stumbled upon a partially unclothed body, bearing signs of severe beatings and abandonment. The victim had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, with her pants partially pulled down. Nearby, her bra, shoes, and personal belongings were scattered. The victim's face had been brutally disfigured, leaving a gruesome scene. The Kansas City Police Department notified Christina's family, forever altering their lives. The victim was identified as 26-year-old Christina King, and the investigation into her tragic demise and the identity of her assailant began. Penny Barnett, the mother of Christina, consistently followed up with the KCPD in her quest for information. However, unbeknownst to Barnett, the police had actually obtained a lead. A used condom discovered at the crime scene alongside Christina's lifeless body. Unfortunately, there was a significant amount of negligence and incompetence on the part of the police, but I will delve into that later. On one occasion, during a phone call, Detective Terry Mast treated Penny Barnett so harshly that she ended up hanging up in tears. When her husband inquired about the reason behind her distress, she revealed that Detective Mast had been insensitive and had used inappropriate language when referring to Christina. The police displayed a clear bias against Christina, as they repeatedly informed the family that she was merely a streetwalker and therefore not a priority. This prejudiced attitude was evident at various points. April, later in life, had the opportunity to view the autopsy photos of her mother and was appalled by the numerous injuries, abrasions and bruises that covered her body. In 2010, Christopher Goodall passed away, leaving the two girls orphaned. However, even before this tragedy, their family had already been fractured by Christina's untimely death. For 5 years, Ashley and April had been fending for themselves, with Ashley, at just 14 years old, scouring Quindaro in search of the person responsible for her mother's murder. Quindaro, once a thriving settlement, had become an abandoned ghost town and was considered unsafe during the 90s. Ashley found herself in perilous situations, desperately seeking closure. Eventually, she got into a truck with someone she believed had a connection to her mother's killer. This individual was supposedly a suspect because Christina King's cousin and 2 other women had stolen a significant quantity of his illicit substances. However, this was merely a rumor circulating on the streets. Fortunately, he turned out not to be the person Ashley was seeking, and he did not cause her any harm. 2 decades passed without any further progress in the case. Then, in December 2021, the family gathered at the intersection of North 27th Street and Sewell Avenue for a prayer vigil and balloon release. The vigil had been organized by Justice for Wyandotte, an advocacy group committed to promoting transparency in law enforcement. The group extended their support to Christina King's investigation, as they aimed to assist the loved ones of those who had been mistreated by the legal system. Khadija Hardway, a member of Justice for Wyandotte, took charge of coordinating the entire event. During her address to the attendees, she emphasized the significance of cases like Christina's, highlighting the urgent need for the Kansas Police Department to establish a cold case unit. Hardway urged the new police chief to allocate existing funds towards the establishment of this unit, as she believed it would enhance transparency in addressing both cold cases and ongoing investigations. This plea sparked a transformative response within the KCPD, ultimately leading to a breakthrough in Christina's case. The newly appointed police chief, Carl Oakman, took Hardway's request seriously and wasted no time in fulfilling it. Immediately after being sworn in on January 1, 2021, he made a solemn commitment to establish a cold case unit within the force. True to his word, a year later, in January 2022, Kansas City's first cold case unit became operational, employing 3 dedicated full-time detectives. This unit would play a crucial role in solving long-standing cold cases. Understanding the origins of Justice for Wyandotte is essential. It all began with Pearl Davis, a 43-year-old mother. Born in 1953, Pearl Barnes was Khadija Hardway's cousin and a devoted mother to her 2 young children. Pearl, also known as Semima Musawir, was an active member of the Kansas City Islamic community. She worked tirelessly to provide for her children, offering her services as a skilled seamstress and running a transportation business that catered to the Chillicothe Correctional Facility. Additionally, she worked as an SRS driver, operated a daycare, sold dinners and bean pies, and actively participated in her family's lives, juggling a diverse range of responsibilities. Given her extensive involvement in the community, a sudden disappearance did not go unnoticed by anyone. Regrettably, Pearl's lifeless body was discovered on November 22, 1996, in an unoccupied residence on Lafayette Avenue in Kansas City. The property had previously belonged to her deceased mother. The autopsy conducted on Pearl revealed a horrifying truth. She had been brutally stabbed more than 40 times, her clothing forcibly removed and scattered nearby. The responsibility of investigating this case fell upon Detective Roger Golubsky of the Kansas Police Department. However, Detective Golubsky faced allegations of misconduct, as he had abused his position of authority on multiple occasions. From 1983 to 2008, the Kansas Police Department failed to properly investigate a series of similar cases involving women, most of whom were working women of similar ages. These women often found themselves grappling with homelessness, substance addiction, or engaged in escort services. Their tragic fates were marked by brutal methods such as strangulation, asphyxiation, blunt force trauma, or stabbing. Their lifeless bodies were heartlessly abandoned in remote locations or isolated structures. Disturbingly, all of these women were discovered either partially or completely unclothed, with their pants pulled down or shirts pulled off. The victim's clothing was typically found in close proximity. Christina King, too, endured these terrifying circumstances. As time passed and the cases grew cold, it became increasingly evident that something was amiss with Golubsky. Despite his familiarity with most, if not all, of the women who had been mercilessly slain, none of the case files indicated his knowledge of these individuals. Furthermore, despite the abundance of potential physical evidence that could have been analyzed, these particular cases received insufficient attention from forensic experts. As a result, evidence collection was often limited, and efforts to identify potential perpetrators through DNA or other forensic means were inadequate. The level of incompetence displayed was truly astounding. In fact, in Christina King's case, the Kansas Police Department received a DNA match with a potential suspect, but failed to conduct a follow-up investigation. Khadija Hardway, moved by the prolonged neglect of Golubski's victims' pleas for justice, found inspiration to collaborate with the community in organizing rallies and demonstrations. The objective was to ensure that the unsolved cases, the faces of the affected women, and their stories would not fade into oblivion. Motivated by Pearl's case, she joined forces with like-minded women to establish a non-profit called Justice for Wyandotte in 2020. The organization worked diligently to combat the department's corrupt individuals. Officers were observed using excessive force, bullying, intimidating, fabricating evidence, wrongfully arresting individuals, and coercing false testimonies to avoid false accusations and imprisonment. Thanks to Justice for Wyandotte shedding light on the crimes, they exposed the systematic corruption. They brought attention to the case of Lamont McIntyre, who was falsely accused and imprisoned for 23 years for a crime he did not commit. Despite being exonerated in 2017, he never received justice. Golubski remained free. However, there were still many unresolved issues regarding Golubski, particularly in victimizing women. During her involvement with the organization, Hardway arranged a meeting with Carl Oakman, a former candidate for chief of police. In this meeting, she highlighted the evident and unacceptable apathy surrounding unsolved cold cases in the community, stressing the enduring impact on Kansas City families and loved ones. She strongly advocated for the establishment of a cold case unit within the Kansas City Police Department. Following the meeting with Oakman, Justice for Wyandotte initiated an awareness campaign and petitioned for the establishment of a dedicated cold case unit, aiming to address the numerous unsolved cases that had occurred in Kansas City since 1965. In 2003, police received a DNA match from the condom found near Christina's body, identifying Gary Davis as the suspect. Surprisingly, he was not immediately questioned, despite being closely monitored by Wyandotte County Community Corrections. Gary Davis, a 52-year-old Kansas City resident, was a truck driver in his early 20s at the time of the alleged incidents involving Christina and Pearl. Due to the nature of his job, it was understandable why he had managed to evade suspicion back then, as he often traveled far from the crime scenes. Although the police were aware of his whereabouts, it took 20 years to finally arrest Davis. The investigation was slow, with a 14-month delay in questioning the suspect, followed by years of silence. After a public appeal for Justice for Wyandotte in 2021, it took another 18 months to process the DNA, form a team, and apprehend the perpetrator. In 2022, the cold case unit connected the dots, confirming that the DNA from both crime scenes matched Gary Davis Sr., the initial suspect. Police also discovered a Facebook page that matched Davis's name and description, containing controversial posts about truck driving and societal double standards. When attempting to contact him, officers found only one operational phone number out of 3 listed, with a full voicemail inbox. Finally, in September 2023, Davis was arrested and charged with the murder of Christina King, with bail set at $500,000. Importantly, there was no statute of limitations, ensuring that justice could be served regardless of the time that had passed. If convicted, Davis could face life imprisonment. In a surprising turn of events, Wyandotte County District Attorney Mark Dupree and Kansas City Police Chief Carl Oakman jointly conducted a press conference to commend their investigative efforts. Dupree highlighted the relentless work of the detectives, while Oakman underscored the importance of a thorough investigation over the significance of the DNA hit. They both emphasized the meticulous analysis required to ensure the correct suspect was apprehended. Meanwhile, in March 2022, attorney Cheryl Pellet, representing Kansas City, shed light on the corrupt environment within the Kansas Police Department. She issued a statement aiming to indict not only disgraced detective Roger Golubsky, but the entire culture that enabled his misconduct. Golubsky, responsible for an unjust arrest, faced federal charges, including kidnapping, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Presently, the Kansas Police Department is collaborating with other law enforcement agencies to determine if Davis could be linked to additional homicides in the region or potentially thousands of miles away due to his occupation as a long-haul driver. Davis is currently a suspect or person of interest in at least 8 other cases. The establishment of the Cold Case Unit through Justice for Wyandotte led to the resolution of 11 more cases. It is evident that the Kansas Police Department bears responsibility for the delayed arrest, which could have been made years earlier. The department owes the families of the victims an apology and a thorough explanation. The distressed loved ones, particularly Christina's daughters, who sought closure for years, were all victims of the department's incompetence.
A young girl disappeared without a trace after leaving her home. She was soon to become the focus of one of the biggest searches in American history. Detectives encountered many unexpected turns during the investigation, and it took them an astounding 62 years to find the answers before they were able to piece together the whole story. Spokane, Washington, is the birthplace of Candace Rogers, also known as Candy, who was born on July 18, 1949. The only child in the family, her parents separated soon after she was born. Since her father lived in the same city, they were able to spend a lot of time together. Candy was a typical sweet child who loved playing with her dog, going on walks in the park with her friends, and being in nature. She also dreamed of becoming a member of the Campfire Girls, an all-girls group that was popular in those days and comparable to the Boy Scouts. They went on hikes, picked up a variety of practical skills, and had fun as a group. Candy was ecstatic to finally have the opportunity to join this organization in 1959, when she was just 9 years old. Selling mints was one of the Campfire Girls' duties. They had to go door to door selling the sweets they had been given by the organization to the residents. Candy was scheduled to do this after school on Friday, March 6. After coming home, she played with her dog, had dinner, and then, at approximately 4:00 p.m., she grabbed about 8 boxes of mints and left. Candy intended to give her neighbors candy as she strolled through the neighborhood streets. Other girls were also expected to visit homes in this neighborhood, but in order to prevent running into each other and giving candy to the same people, they had pre-designated certain streets. Her mother started to worry a few hours later since Candy still had not come back. She was noticeably running late. She was meant to get home by 6:00 p.m. Her mother made the decision to go outside and look for her as night fell. Candy's grandfather went with them as they strolled around their neighborhood, but Candy was nowhere to be seen. Soon after, a few neighbors, family members, and friends joined the search in an attempt to assist, but they were unable to locate Candy, so Candy's mother called the police. It was already getting dark on the streets by then, and it was becoming more and more obvious that Candy might have suffered some sort of harm. The neighbors were all questioned by the police as soon as they joined the search. It did not take long for them to realize Candy had only sold 1 box of mints. This suggested that she might have experienced something soon after leaving her house. But a neighbor said that at around 6:30 p.m., she had seen the girl on a nearby street. This was strange because Candy's mother had already gone looking for her at that point. Strange observations were also shared by Candy's grandfather. A car was speeding and nearly hit him when he was looking for his granddaughter. The car even hit the curb. He was on the same street as the witness who had seen the girl. Sadly, he missed the license plate, but he did recall that it belonged to a green 1953 Ford. Despite providing a description of the vehicle, the police were unable to locate it. By 9:00 at night, they found a number of mint boxes scattered across the road next to a bridge. The fact that Candy was obviously the owner of these boxes added to the general anxiety. The search was concentrated here by the police, who went over the riverbanks and the small area of woods on either side. They searched the area all night long without finding Candy. Local newspapers began to report on Candy's disappearance by morning, and soon the case was being covered by media outlets throughout the state. Child disappearances in the vicinity of their homes were unusual in 1959 because they occurred very infrequently. Candy's town's residents were extremely disturbed because they had not dealt with a situation like this in a long time. Police intensified their search early the following day, sending out more officers, mounted police, off-road vehicles, and even military personnel who were using helicopters to scan the area. Many volunteers from the city and surrounding areas also contributed to the search efforts. The search was one of the largest in the nation's history at the time, with over 1,000 people taking part in total. The search area extended 11 miles around the girl's house, but they still could not find her. On the same day, another tragic incident occurred. 3 of the 5 crew members were lost when a helicopter engaged in the search clipped power lines and crashed. Days went by during which time the search produced no results. In an attempt to find Candy, police officers kept working literally around the clock in several shifts. In the early days of the investigation, investigators received about 750 tips. They checked every one of them carefully, but they all ended in dead ends. 15 days later, 2 soldiers from the nearby base went hunting in the woods west of Spokane. When they saw kids' shoes on the ground there, they were instantly reminded of Candy's disappearance. Since many military personnel had participated in the search, they were all fully informed about the case. After informing the police of their discovery, Candy's grandfather was shown the shoes. He affirmed that his granddaughter does, in fact, own the shoes. For the search, the police made their way into the woods. In a matter of minutes, one of the officers discovered the girl's body after seeing a foot protruding from the bushes. She lay in the pine branch-covered underbrush. The cause of death was identified by medical professionals as strangulation. For this, the offender had ripped a section of fabric from her skirt. Candy had been bound, based on marks on her hands and feet, even though no ropes were discovered close to the body. It was also determined that the victim had experienced sexual abuse. Police discovered a green car seat cover close to the crime scene during their investigation, but they were unable to determine whether it was connected to the murder. Even though officers detected a tiny purple stain on Candy's clothing that had a grape-flavored chewing gum odor, they were unable to link it to the case. When the police could find no solid leads that would lead them to the murderer, they searched for any hints. As they went through the incoming tips, investigators looked into the potential involvement of hundreds of people, including neighbors, strange individuals, and convicted criminals. They soon turned their attention to Alfred Graves, a 50-year-old man. It was an odd reason that made him a suspect. On the same day that Candy's body was found, he committed suicide. He did it in his car, not far from the location of the mint boxes. Additionally, Candy's house was only a few hundred yards away from him. Alfred's car contained a rope and a woman's hairpins, which the police found when they discovered his body. After obtaining a search warrant, investigators proceeded to his home and discovered a plethora of newspaper clippings containing articles about sexual crimes against women and girls. The police also discovered that his wife had confessed to having suspicions about him killing Candy, and that a number of women had accused him of harassing them. Investigators were unable to uncover any evidence connecting Alfred to Candy's murder in spite of this unsettling series of events. Although it seemed hard to prove his guilt, they were hesitant to absolve him of suspicion. Investigators investigated additional suspects, whose numbers continued to rise. A number of months after the murder, they had a long list of names that filled several pages. The police went through each name carefully, but each time they were unable to locate any proof of their connection. Hugh Morse, a serial killer, was another suspect that the police later had. He was taken into custody in 1961 on a number of charges, and there was a fascinating reason why he was made a suspect. It is remembered that Hugh used to chew grape-flavored gum nonstop, and that something akin to it was discovered on Candy's clothing. The fact that he murdered 2 women in Spokane a few months after Candy passed away gave rise to additional suspicions. Hugh started committing crimes at a young age. After being arrested for the first time for abusing a woman, he was merely let go from the army, where he was serving at the time, with no real repercussions. He later served just 6 months in prison after committing several robberies in Los Angeles. Following his release, he used the promise of ice cream to entice two 8-year-old girls to a remote location. After abusing them sexually, he was arrested once more. He was surprisingly able to stay out of jail. He was admitted to a mental health facility after a medical commission declared him to be a sexual psychopath. He was freed by the doctors after 2 years, who thought he was healed. After moving to Spokane, Hugh began breaking into women's windows. He killed and assaulted the 28-year-old woman after breaking into her home in November 1959. A decade of months later, he went into the home of a 69-year-old woman and did the exact same thing he had done to the previous victim. A month later, he attacked another woman, stabbing her several times, but she survived. He fled the city after committing these crimes, and in the months that followed, he committed countless more crimes, including stabbing women and girls with a knife, forcing them into sexual relationships, and killing 2 more people. Hugh moved frequently between states and cities up until the FBI took up his case. He was quickly apprehended after being placed on the list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in the nation. Hugh tried to take his own life in his cell after receiving multiple life sentences, but the guards intervened to save him, and he went on to fulfill his sentence. Detectives in Candy's case paid him multiple visits in prison, but he denied any involvement. In addition, he underwent a polygraph examination, which demonstrated his honesty. However, because of its dubious accuracy, this tool is worthless in court. Hugh was the police's top suspect due to his biography and the fact that he was a Spokane resident at the time of the murder, but he insisted on denying any involvement, and there was insufficient evidence to connect him to the crime. Police later turned their attention to another suspect, Howard Barnett, a 49-year-old man. He was taken into custody in February 1960 on allegations of sexually abusing the young girl. He committed suicide in his Spokane police station cell a few days after the arrest. He had previously scrawled the words, "I have a sin before the Lord," in his own blood on the wall. Only after her husband's passing did his wife find out about his arrest. She questioned the police, asking if he had killed Candy. Investigators started looking into his possible involvement, but they were unable to uncover any proof of his guilt. The fact that Howard lived on the victim's neighboring street kept him as one of the primary suspects. Police pursued this case for many years, looking into additional suspects and obtaining fresh leads. They were contacted at one point by a woman who said she had seen a green car following Candy the day she vanished. Once more, the investigators concentrated their efforts on finding this particular vehicle, but this did not produce any noteworthy outcomes. It was peculiar, nevertheless, that the woman disclosed this information so long after the crime. This case was periodically reopened in the decades that followed, but investigators were always at a loss. It is interesting to note that in addition to looking for fresh leads, they also had to resist false accusations. 13 people came forward with confessions to Candy's murder, but the police found that they were all lying. These people were limited to repeating information from the newspapers and were unable to offer any information that the murderer would be aware of. Remarkably, these kinds of actions are frequent and prominent instances of people confessing to crimes they did not commit. The police department had many detectives come and go over the years, all trying to solve this crime. Not just in their city, but throughout the entire state, Candy's murder stood out as one of the most well-known and enigmatic cases. It had a big effect on a lot of people. Parents felt comfortable letting their kids play outside prior to the murder, but many had second thoughts about safety following this case. When this case was reopened in the early 2000s, a new detective made the decision to employ contemporary tools. Luckily, the police had meticulously gathered and stored all the evidence in 1959, which made it possible for specialists to locate a sample of male semen on Candy's clothing. Examining the sample proved very difficult, especially since it had been stored for several decades. However, experts were able to extract the DNA profile after much work, and they uploaded it to the FBI database, but sadly, there was not a single match. Additionally, investigators cross-examined the profile using samples from a number of suspects. However, none of them were identified as Candy's murderer. Many people were certain that Hugh Morse was responsible for the murder over the years, but the forensics showed he was unrelated to the incident. Consequently, the investigation came to a dead end once more. Although the perpetrator of Candy's sexual assault and death provided the police with a DNA sample, identifying them remained a difficult task. When the case was reopened in 2021, a new detective made the decision to use genetic genealogy, an innovative method of DNA analysis. The detective hoped that this method, which had been used to solve hundreds of cold case cases, would finally put an end to one of the longest-running investigations. He made contact with multiple laboratories that specialize in this analysis, only to be met with disappointment once more. In order to apply this technique, specialists had to look at the original DNA sample. Despite numerous efforts, every laboratory came to the conclusion that the sample had deteriorated too much to allow for the extraction of the required data. Suddenly, a long-awaited breakthrough materialized as the detective turned to face the final laboratory. With the use of cutting-edge instruments, the experts successfully examined the sample, providing them with the essential profile of the offender. They meticulously searched for the DNA owner's distant relatives by uploading the profile to genealogical databases. They examined thousands of people before focusing on one particular family. After looking into this family, they concluded that one of the three brothers' DNA samples was most likely the one in question. But now there was a new problem because the three had passed away. Still, the specialists and investigators learned that one of the brothers had a daughter, and the authorities got in touch with her. Even though the woman was horrified that her father might have killed a young child, she agreed to help without thinking twice. She gave the experts a sample of her own DNA, and they verified that she was closely related to the person whose semen was discovered on Candy's clothing. These findings allowed detectives to quickly secure a court order authorizing the exhumation of her father's grave. After 62 years since the murder, the culprit's identity was eventually made public thanks to experts' extraction of a DNA profile from his remains. The man's name was John Hoff. The results of the analysis showed that Candy's clothing and John's DNA were completely matched. John Hoff was never on that list, even though there were hundreds of suspects over the years. Detectives looking into his biography found evidence of his involvement in other crimes. He was 20 years old and lived less than a mile from Candy's home at the time of her murder. In addition, he was an army soldier who was stationed close to the location where the girl's body was found. He attacked a woman 2 years after the murder, bound her, sexually assaulted her, and tried to kill her, but she lived. After being detained, John was only given a 6-month prison sentence. Furthermore, he received a humiliating discharge from the army. John began a family after being freed, with 2 sons and 2 daughters. He continued to live an apparently normal life, staying off the police radar. John had multiple job changes. He once sustained a severe chemical burn to his face while working in a food packaging plant, which left a permanent scar. 11 years after Candy was killed, in June 1970, John ended his own life by hanging himself without leaving a note. It was also established by the police that the victim may have known him. Candy was friends with his sister, who was 10 years old at the time. Years later, she told detectives that after her friend was murdered, she cried in her brother's arms, unaware that he was the one who killed Candy. Regretfully, the girl's parents passed away before the killer's identity was made public. 4 years after the tragic event, in 1963, Candy's father took his own life. Her mother passed away in 2006. He may not have been able to deal with the loss of his own daughter, although this is still a mystery. However, this case was ultimately resolved, making it one of the longest inquiries. It involved different generations in addition to different detectives over a span of 62 years. There was only one police officer who had been involved in the 1959 investigation, present at the press conference when the killer's name was revealed. He expressed gratitude to God for granting him the opportunity to live a long life and discover the truth. Regarding John's daughter, at first, she found it hard to accept that her father had committed such a horrible act. She later came to terms with this reality and called her father a monster for taking the life of a helpless girl. She regretted that he was not brought to justice while he was alive. Interestingly, John committed suicide exactly when his daughter turned 9, the same age as Candy. We may never know whether there is a connection because it is currently unknown.